Alright, this is going to be me sharpening a chef's knife that is pretty dull. It's got a few chips in it, pretty badly rolled edge. I'm going to reprofile the edge, thin out the bevel, and put a between 19 and 20 degree edge on it, just to test the sharpness of it, see how sharp it is, see if it cuts paper. It won't even try to cut paper. It's pretty dull. You definitely see the light shining off the flat spots on the blade. You start off with a really low grit to thin it out, and then I'll reprofile it. Use aluminum oxide sharpening stones. Use water to keep them wet so they cut the steel. I don't use grinders, don't use belt sanders. The only time I use a belt sander is if I had a really messed up blade that has some really bad chips or a bad broken tip. Then I'll use a belt grinder. But even then I'm careful because you don't want to overheat the blade and ruin the temper of the steel. Once you do that, the knife pretty much becomes useless. Might take a little bit to thin this blade out, but it's got to be done to get all those chips out of it and get the edge back to a working edge. And then I'll put a scary sharp edge on it. This video is just to kind of show how I go through and sharpen a knife. It's not really an instructional video on the system that I use. I use the Edge Pro Professional. I can do a later video on that if people desire, on how I use it. Everybody kind of uses it a little bit differently. I think it's a phenomenal system. You can kind of customize your sharpening with your hand. See how I hold the knife, I can angle the knife to get to the edge more or whatever. Some of the clamping systems out there, you can't do that. You're limited by the clamp. I'm not saying that they're bad, it's just what I prefer. stone clean so it keeps cutting. This is the longest step in the sharpening process. Once I get this bevel set, the next step's going to be relatively easy, relatively fast. Which is basically putting a really sharp edge on it. Just following the bevel that I'm making right now. Alright. So you got most of the chips out, so a couple more. I don't thin every knife, only ones that need it. If they're really, really dull or have chips that are relatively deep like this one did. If the blade doesn't need to be thin, I won't do it. I only do it if it needs it. And typically we'll follow the manufacturer's bevel. Since I'm reprofiling this one, I'll be making my own bevel. Like I said, this is by far the longest step in the process. Takes a little bit. There we go. Even up the other side. Sorry, it's probably kind of a long video. I just want to put one video out there, my process, my progression of grits. It's how I normally do it, just so people know. So you know, kind of know what I'm doing to your knives. Okay. Done with the thinning. Now onto the actual sharpening. This may even cut paper right now. There's a big burr on there, so it probably won't. Yeah, it won't quite grab it yet. But it will. This particular knife I reprofiled or thinned it out at 13 degrees because I want my final edge to be 19 and a half. That's a really good edge for sharpening. I'm sorry, for everyday use in the kitchen. This is called an angle cube that I have. There's indicator marks on here to help you out, give you a rough idea as far as an angle, but I like to use this to be a little bit more precise. Sometimes the angle depends on, right there is where I want it. Kind of depends on the thickness of my sharpening stone. That'll change the angle ever so slightly, but it doesn't take much to change the angle. Alright, this is going to be my final sharpening angle. This one's at 19, almost 19 and a half degrees. What I'm feeling for there is the burr, just to make sure I got a consistent burr. I mean, typically, if I'm not thinning a knife, I don't typically bring the knife to a burr with this 120 grit because it's so rough. But since I'm reprofiling this one, I'm going to take off a little bit of the thinning bevel. So it's a little bit faster using this stone. Typically, I don't do that. Usually, I use the 220. Doing this just to speed the process up a little bit. This doesn't hurt the knife because it's I'm taking off all the steel anyway. Typically the 120 was a little aggressive to sharpen with. It's more for repair and thinning. That's what I'm doing. I don't use a lot of pressure when I'm cutting, when I'm pushing, my push strokes. Just enough where I feel it biting in. There's no reason to push hard with this system. These stones are, in my opinion, very Very efficient, very good. The only drawback to them is they do, especially these softer ones, these lower grits do wear out faster. Alright, I'm done with this stone. I just checked to see how high my bevel is. And it looks perfect. Now from here, I'm going to move up in grits and go through my progression of stones. Next will be the 220. Give me a second here to get the stone set up. You'll hear as I go up in grits, the sound of the stone cutting is going to get quieter and quieter. Second, some oil on that arm. Squeak it. Quieter down. The way I sharpen with these wet stones, granted it's definitely a little bit slower than a belt grinder and or a carbide sharpener when you pull knives through the strip off steel. But in my opinion, this method you get a lot better edge than you do with any of those systems. Again, just feeling for the burr. The edges that I put on a knife, they'll be a lot better than the factory edges. Because unless you get really high-end knives, the factory is not going to do a hand sharpening. They're going to use a belt grinder or something similar. And it'll be sharp. I'm not saying new knives are dull by any means, but a hand sharpened edge will be a lot more durable and a lot sharper and last longer than a belt ground edge. that stone. Basically, as you go up in grits, you're basically refining the scratch pattern from the prior stone. The stones get finer and finer as it goes up in grits. Depending on the knife, the condition of the blade, you can sometimes skip grits. I typically don't. I just like to keep the same routine all the time, but once in a while I do, but not typically. I can sharpen pretty much any knife, pocket knives, outdoor knives, hunting knives, you know, anywhere from your skinning knives, gutting knives, caping knives, you know, whatever, fillet knives, kitchen knives, tactical knives, serrations. I can sharpen all those blades. Scissors. And I use scissors in the same system, so there's no grinding on them. Yeah, another advantage of doing sharpening by hand, I guess, with wet stones like this, as opposed to the belt grinders and all those, is the longevity of the knife is kept. You're saving years on your knife. A lot of times with those machine-powered sharpeners, they take off too much steel, or an unnecessary amount of steel, which is why I use it for major repairs. I use a belt grinder, but that's only knives in bad shape. It's great here, hard to use any pressure, mainly just the weight of the arm. All right, on to the next one, to the 600. I've been sharpening for about, I don't know, 10 years. Started off as a kid with me on the farm. Dad wanted me to sharpen his hunting knives. I did it in an Arkansas whetstone for completely freehand. That's how I kind of obviously I wasn't very good at it. I was just a kid, but it's always good to start out freehand because you understand feel, sounds of sharpening. So started out there. Slowly, I just been in kind of like knives and collected them. And I figured I want to maintain them, so I just started sharpening. And about 10 years ago is when I started getting a little bit serious about it and decided to provide the service to other people. I figure I've gotten pretty good at it, so I figure I can get people's knives sharper. After all, a sharp knife's a safe knife. That's what they say. Sharp knife, you gotta force the knife to cut things, so it typically is theoretically safer. Just if you get a nice sharp knife, you gotta be careful. It is sharp, obviously. Yeah, and that burr is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller as you go up in grits. Sometimes I'll stop at this stone here at the 600, depending on intended use of the knife. But most of the time I'll go through 1200 grit. Almost all kitchen knives. All other knives I'll go all the way up through 3000 grit, and then I'll finish on a strop. Kitchen knives I'll go through 1200 grit and then finish on a ceramic hone. Put a micro bevel on it. Alright, done with that one. Now I'm onto the 1000 grit. Yeah, future videos, if I keep, if I want to keep doing them, putting them on the site, on the Facebook page, and or YouTube. I won't go through every single stone just for the sake of time and length of the video. Just what I do it now, I guess I want to get one video out there just kind of showing my beginning to end sharpening process. How quiet that stone cuts. It's a lot harder stone than the other ones. That burr sounded really good, very consistent. Alright, and with that one onto the 1200 grit, be the final grit. And I'll clean the blade up and put on this ceramic hone. Then we'll test it. I can sharpen any type of steel as well. It doesn't matter if it's if it's one of these so-called super steels, the high vanadium steels, M390, CPM M4. I can sharpen. Doesn't matter. I can sharpen all those. Some of those it might take a little bit more time, but it can be done. These stones will cut any steel. And I'm sure I have CPM M4 blades, my own collection of knives. Sharpened them, no problem. S30V. S30V is probably one of my favorite steels. It's corrosion resistant, doesn't really rust, but it holds an edge like crazy. And it can take a really, really sharp edge. You hear how quiet this stone is. This is just kind of some of the final strokes that I put on a blade. That was stopping. Just want to run the whole length of the blade with the stone on it. It's more of a cosmetic thing. Now you get a nice even shine along the sharpened edge. That final burr off, the burring block. Oh yeah, she's pretty sharp, very sharp. It's my ceramic rod, very light strokes, a little bit steeper than my sharpening angle. This is all done by feel. So put a micro bevel at the very apex of the edge. This is what I recommend when you get your knives back after so often, after some use. If you know it's not quite cutting as good, I recommend getting a ceramic hone and just kind of doing this exact same thing right here. You can do this 10 or 15 times before they need to be completely resharpened again. Look in the light, you can see the secondary bevel, you know, shining. The light will bounce off from it. A little bit different than the primary bevel. Oh yeah, she's sharp. Alright, let's see if we'll cut this piece of foam book paper now. Oh yeah, she's sharp. Very slow. Get the complete edge. See, make sure she cuts evenly all the way through. Alright, that's it.